kick off. Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to this year's, the first of this year's winter lecture series. The theme for the lectures this year is Aotearoa in 2030, and it emerged from discussions that we had as part of the sustainability network in the Faculty of Science. And the basic question was, rather than kind of a dystopian vision of New Zealand in 2030, it was more along the lines of what can we hope for in New Zealand in 2030. A lot of the challenges we face today they require a kind of long-term perspective that really rarely gets attention in the media. Things tend to be on a kind of daily, weekly news cycle, and perhaps we don't think enough about the kind of direction we're heading in. And there's good reason to think long-term, because there's long-term action required to solve some of the major challenges we're facing. So this series is in 6 parts over the next 6 weeks, and it's going to look at 6 very different domains and try and provide this long-term perspective by calling on experts in different areas to present a kind of their vision for New Zealand in 2030 in their area. So that's going to cover, next week we have New Zealand conservation in 2030 with Dr. Kate McGuinness-Ing and Associate Professor James Russell. Then we have our rivers in 2030, Professor Gillian Lewis and Dr. Marawa Murulane. Then we'll hear from Professor Terry Collins, who's the Theresa Hines Professor of Green Chemistry at Carnegie Mellon University, on green chemistry in 2030. Then a trio from the University of Auckland, Sue Militai, Dan Hikuroa and Mark Costello will be talking about our oceans in 2030. And we'll conclude the series on the 22nd of August with Professor Robin Kearns and Dr. Alex McMillan talking about livable cities in 2030. So a real range of topics, all united by this idea of where we're going to be in 2030, or where we want to be in 2030. But today, we're going to hear about our civil society in 2030. So in many ways, perhaps the most complex topic of the 6. And we'll be hearing from Dr. Mathison Russell and Dr. Danny Osborne. Mathison's going to talk about political polarisation and science denial. But before that, Danny Osborne's going to talk to us about why is social change so rare. So, Danny, I'll leave it to you.
Can you hear me okay with this? Okay, cool. That seems to be going. First off, thanks to Quentin and Nikki for putting together this lecture series. I'm really happy to be a part of such an eclectic group of scholars, and really happy to be presenting some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing, looking at the difficulties in social change. So obviously, if we're looking at what society is going to be like in 2030, it's important to understand the various barriers that people often encounter when attempting to engage in social change. But before we begin and get into the various difficulties in social change, I wanted to start with a brief demonstration. I should start with a caution. I've actually never done this demonstration before, and when I was planning this, I didn't realize that we were going to be filmed, and I also thought that we were going to have a little wider attendance. So we'll essentially be doing a census of the room rather than a random sample. But that said, we can still go ahead as planned. If it fails, it'll fail pretty wonderfully, I guess. To get started with the demonstration, if I can please just have the people on the right-hand side of the class put your heads down for about 30 seconds. So if you're on this side of the classroom, please just go ahead and put your heads down on the table or promise not to look at the slide. And if you're on the left side, just briefly read this slide. The USB driver installation noise was not part of the demonstration. Okay, so if you had your heads down, please go ahead and put your heads up. And if you had your heads up, please go ahead and put your heads down, or just don't look at the slides. Okay. Okay, now if everybody can please look up and just briefly look at the painting. I'll give you a couple of seconds to look at it, and then I'm going to ask you 4 questions about the painting. And if you, it doesn't look like people have paper, but just remember your responses, I guess. Okay. So the first 2 questions, on a scale of 1 to 7, I enjoy looking at this painting. 1, strongly disagree, to 7, strongly agree. Question 2, there's something unappealing about the look of this painting. Again, 1 to 7, how much you agree versus disagree with the statement. And if you can just either memorize your responses to these 2 questions or write them down on something, that would be great. So 1 to 7 for the first 2 questions, and again 1 to 7 for questions 3 and 4. This painting is aesthetically pleasing, and question 4, this painting is good. Again, 1 to 7, whether or not you agree or disagree with those 4 statements. Again, not part of the presentation. So what I'll do is just get 10 people on the left side of the classroom to provide your numbers for those first 4 questions, and then go to the right-hand side of the class and do the same. So if you're on the left-hand side of the class, could you please just call out your responses to those 4 questions? How about starting here? Yeah, if you know. Okay, how about?
5, 3, 5, 6.
Okay, next.
3, 3, 6, 6.
Okay.
5, 5, 6, 6.
Okay, next.
5, 4, 6, 4.
Okay.
5, 4, 6, 6.
Okay. A couple more, yes.
6, 2, 5, 4.
Okay, and 4 more, please.
4, 4, 2, 2.
Actually, just to make sure. Okay, some more people from this side of the classroom, please.
5, 2, 5, 5.
Okay,
6, 2, 4, 3.
and 2 more, please.
3, 5, 5, 3.
Was that right? 3, 5, 3, 5?
Yes.
Okay, and 1 last person, please.
6, 2, 6, 6.
Okay, and now on the right side of the classroom, can I get 9?
6, 3, 5, 5.
Okay,
6, 1, 5, 6.
okay,
4, 4, 6.
okay,
4, 1, 5, 5.
Okay.
6455.
Okay, 4 more.
5556.
Okay.
4556.
Okay. Yes.
7177.
Okay, and one final person.
4233.
4233. Awesome. Thank you very much. So looking at my means over here, I'm not expecting to be too terribly impressed with what we see, but let's see. Yeah, so I pretty much failed miserably in front of a class of the general public, and it was filmed. So great. But basically what this demonstration was meant to hopefully show was that we have a general tendency to prefer things that have been around for longer. Again, we didn't show that here. I'll say that it's because it wasn't a random sample and we didn't randomly assign people. Or it could be due to social psychology's infamous replication crisis. But needless to say, some previous research has done similar things, just to show you what the manipulation was. So some of you were told that the painting was 100 years old. Others were told that it was 5 years old. And then you all obviously answered the same set of 4 questions about the painting. What past research has done in a much more controlled environment has done looking at this very same question has demonstrated that people have a basic tendency to favor the status quo. So when I tell you that something's been around for a very long time, you're much more likely to say that you support it, you're much more likely to defend it, and you're much more likely to see a greater value in something that's been around longer than something that's been around for a shorter period of time. And Edelman and colleagues did this in a set of 5 separate studies in the US, where they wanted to see if whether or not people have this general bias towards supporting the status quo. So what they did, they had a very similar setup to what we just previously did, in that they had a random sample of participants assess how favorable a set of 5 different sets of things were to them. So in one study, they looked at participants agree with changing degree requirements for the university. In another study, they had them evaluate how beneficial acupuncture was. In the third one, they had participants evaluate the same painting that I just showed you. And then a fourth study had them evaluate how beautiful a tree was. And then in a final study, they had them taste chocolate and indicate how flavorful the chocolate was. In all of these studies, participants were told that the various objects were either old or new, not like 100-year-old chocolate, but that the recipe had been around for a long time. And then had participants evaluate how positive the different objects were. And what you can see across the 5 different studies is that objects that had been around for a longer period of time were evaluated as much more positive than the alternative. So here, when looking at a university rule that was existing for 10 years, there wasn't much difference between participants' evaluations of how positive that university rule was versus an alternative that was being proposed. However, when you told participants that the same rule had been around for 100 years, participants were much more positive and optimistic about the rule relative to an alternative that was being proposed in its place. Same thing for acupuncture. When participants were told that acupuncture had been around for 250 years, they evaluated it as moderately positive. However, participants told the same information, but then embedded within the manipulation was that acupuncture had been around for 2,000 years. You see that participants are much more favorable towards acupuncture. And then finally, when telling participants that a tree was either 500 years old, 1,500 years old, or 4,500 years old, you see a quite linear increase in how favorable participants viewed the tree based on how old it was. And so many of you might be asking, why am I talking about trees when we're supposed to be talking about political attitudes? And the reason is there is a basic bias that carries over into the political domain. That is, people have this general preference to justify and reinforce the status quo. And this was noted by John Jost and colleagues' work in 2003, looking at political conservatism as a motivated social cognition. And what they argued in this paper was that people's tendency to justify the societal status quo was done in order to meet certain needs that are presumed to be present across the general population. So according to Jost and colleagues, people have a basic motivation to justify the status quo. And the reason for this is because justifying the status quo meets certain needs that all of us have. So justifying the status quo in particular meets our needs for knowledge. So if we're justifying something that's been in place, we can have a little bit more certainty about what's going to happen in the future. If we endorse something that's new or novel or that challenges the status quo, it introduces a bit of uncertainty into the environment and an uncertainty that we're uncomfortable with. Likewise, the status quo helps us fight off concerns about threat and danger. So if something's been around for a long time, it's presumably protected us from threat, etc. And likewise, endorsing the status quo helps meet relational needs. So if something's been around for a while, we generally assume that others must also support it. And these three basic needs feed into our propensity to justify the status quo. So just like the participants in the previous study who endorsed things that had been around for longer, similar things can be seen in the political domain. So people endorse policies that have been around for a while because they meet these three basic needs. So all of this assumes that social change is actually quite difficult to achieve. Is there actually any evidence for that? If you were to look around in the newspapers today, you'd probably see quite a lot of writings about protests in the US, about Donald Trump, etc. But when you look at things at a more holistic level and average across what's been going over the last couple of decades, you'll see that social change is actually quite rare. And so this is a paper that my colleagues and I did a couple of years ago, looking at the number of, or the percentage of people who have engaged in different forms of collective action. So attempts to change the societal status quo. And you can see that we broke things down into different forms of collective action. So things like signing a petition, moving on to a little more effortful things like joining a boycott, that is just not buying something, and then moving further into attending a peaceful demonstration, joining a strike, or other forms of protest. And what you see when looking across these various countries, now here I'm just highlighting a few of the countries that we focused on in this paper, but the same pattern appears across over 130 different countries. It just wouldn't fit on a single slide. So just looking at these handful of countries we have up here, we see that only 47% of the general public have engaged in something like signing a petition. So this is a very, very, very low effort activity, yet less than half of the population have done something to try and change the system. When moving to something slightly more challenging, that is not buying stuff, we see that only 12% of people across these various nations have done something like join a political boycott. And we see similar low levels across the different forms of collective action. So attending a peaceful demonstration, joining a strike, or other forms of protest. Less than 10% of the population have ever done this. And in fact, when looking at the percentage of people who have never or would never do these acts, we see 44% of the public would never engage in any form of protest. In other words, this basic tendency to justify the status quo tends to create a large barrier that prevents people from engaging in collective action. One question that you might immediately have is why are people so resistant to the status quo, or to changes to the status quo? And one potential explanation for this is justifying the way things are provides a palliative benefit to people's well-being. That is, by endorsing things that provide certainty and protect individuals from threat, provides some sort of psychological comfort to individuals. A study that my colleague Chris Sibley and I did recently looked at the potential that this tendency to justify the status quo could buffer people from the experiences of social injustices. Now we know that experiences with social injustice are a critical motivator of collective action. So if you've been aggrieved, you're much more likely to participate in collective action than people who haven't been aggrieved. But it's also possible that this motivation to justify the system could dampen that general tendency to engage in collective action after experiencing an injustice. So to look at this question, Chris and I looked at data from the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Study. Here's a picture of all of our participants or the location of all of our participants in 2011. This map has gotten much bigger over the last couple of weeks, actually. We just engaged in a large booster sample, and about 1 in 10 New Zealanders have been sent our survey as of a couple weeks ago. So hopefully this map is going to get much darker over the upcoming months. But nonetheless, at time 3, we had close to 7,000 participants complete our survey. Included in the survey were the following predictors. So perceptions of group and individual-based injustice. So if you've been personally aggrieved, or if your group's experienced an injustice, as well as people's general motivation to justify the system. In terms of our outcomes, we focused on participants' perceptions of their living standards, as well as their willingness to engage in collective action. So I'll briefly go over the regressions that we ran to test our hypotheses, and then show you the figures that illustrate our effects. So first off, when looking at some of the individual responses, so here we have perceptions of participants' living standard as well as their psychological distress. We see, not too surprisingly, the more people believe that they personally experienced an injustice, the worse their living standards and the greater their psychological distress. So if you've been treated unfairly, this eventually influences your well-being. However, what the second step of our regression showed was that it critically depended on people's motivation to justify the system. So people who strongly were motivated to justify the system, these perceptions of injustice had a much weaker effect on their well-being. When looking at support for collective action, we find the same thing. Experiences with injustice wind up motivating collective action. However, people's motivation to justify the system hinders or dampens that inclination to engage in collective action. So to show you what this looks like in a figure, I'm looking at people's living standards. When people were low on system justification, so that is, they were not as motivated to justify the system as people who are high on system justification, we see that there's a strong negative relationship between experiencing injustices and declines in their well-being. So more injustice, the worse off you are in society. However, for people who strongly endorsed the belief that the status quo was fair and good, the effects of experiencing injustices were much weaker. When we move to collective action, we see a similar pattern of results, but in the opposite direction. So experiencing injustices should increase your motivation to engage in collective action, which is what we found for people who are low on system justification. However, for people who are high on system justification, these experiences of injustice had a much weaker effect on their willingness to engage in collective action. So in other words, by supporting the status quo, individuals were much less willing to engage in collective action following perceived injustice. So now all of this really kind of begs the question of, if we're looking towards New Zealand in 2013, how can we overcome this basic resistance to social change? Well, fortunately, Irina Fejina and colleagues looked at the possibility of using this fundamental motivation to justify the system as a way to facilitate social change. And what they did in this particular study was they reframed pro-environmental behaviors in terms of things that were consistent with the status quo. So in particular, what they did in this study was, it was an American sample, but they had participants read a passage that framed pro-environmental behaviors as being a way to protect and preserve the American way of life. They also told participants that pro-environmental behaviors were patriotic and it helped to conserve the country's natural resources. So you can see that by reframing environmentalism as something that's consistent with the status quo, could potentially be one way in which we could fight this basic resistance to social change. In the control condition, participants weren't exposed to any message. They were just asked about their pro-environmental intentions and behaviors. So the outcomes that they assessed in the study were intentions and behaviors. In terms of their results, participants in the control condition, the slope is actually not significant, but participants in the control condition, it looks like the lower on system justification participants were, the more they intended to engage in pro-environmental behaviors. In contrast, when participants were exposed to the system preservation framing, that is, engaging in pro-environmental behaviors is patriotic, it helps preserve the country's traditions, you see the exact opposite trend, whereby participants who have this basic fundamental need to justify the system wound up being more supportive of or more likely to engage in pro-environmental behaviors if they were high rather than low in system justification. So intentions are one thing, behaviors are another. We know this from social psych research. So what about the likelihood that participants would engage in actual pro-environmental behaviors? Well, the researchers found essentially the same pattern of results. So when framing pro-environmentalism as being consistent with the nation's values and something that helps preserve the status quo, you see that you can actually harness this justification or this tendency to justify the system and move it towards supporting social change. So just to wrap things up before passing things off, basically what I've talked about today is that people have a basic tendency to want to favor the status quo. And they do this because it meets important needs in terms of your needs for certainty, your needs to reduce threat, and your needs to relate with others. And in doing so, by supporting the status quo, it does help reduce people's distress in the face of injustice. But at the same time, it also decreases the motivation to protest and to attempt to strive for social change. However, as the final study that I presented suggests, we can actually use this basic motivation to justify the system and turn it in a potential avenue towards social change. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop and pass it off to Mathison. It's for the.
Hello, good to be with you. Thank you to Quentin for the invitation. My name is Mathison Russell. I teach in the philosophy department here at the University of Auckland. So let's get into it. How will political life look in Aotearoa in 2030? Well, if trends overseas are any guide, we could be in for quite a ride over the next decade or two. In the US, political polarization has reached unprecedented levels. Polling data of various kinds attest to the fact that in the US today, Republicans and Democrats view each other not only as ideologically mistaken, but also as, to some extent, malevolent and as a threat to the nation's well-being. In Australia, political scientists are actually observing a similar trend. Segments of the population are moving further to the left and further to the right of the political spectrum. So it would be naive to think that here in Aotearoa we'd be immune to these same sorts of phenomena. And in fact, just this month, the New Zealand government issued a strategic defence policy statement in which the Defence Forces listed as one of the current threats to the continued existence of our open society, quote, public distrust of institutions and elites, questions around the credibility of information, and increasing political polarisation, in some cases exacerbated by foreign influence campaigns. But what's the problem with questioning the credibility of information, or for that matter with political polarisation per se? In this talk I'm going to describe how polarisation can affect not only our political life but also our knowledge of the world and our ability to reason together about solutions to pressing problems. And I also want to try to illuminate some of the mechanisms by which political polarisation takes root. And as a case study, I want to focus primarily on the issue of climate change denial. So why do many people reject the scientific consensus on issues such as climate change? Is it because they're ignorant of scientific research? Is it because perhaps those who deny that climate change is real have poor reasoning skills? Well, in fact, according to researchers, climate skepticism can't be attributed to either of these two factors. Studies have shown that climate skeptics are more or less as well informed about what the scientific view is on relevant matters as their peers. And also that as a group, climate skeptics are just as competent at reasoning about evidence and arguments as their peers. In fact, political affiliation is a much stronger predictor of your views. So conservatives in the US, in fact, who have high scores on ordinary science intelligence tests, are in fact more likely to reject the expert consensus on climate change than those with lower scores. So here, among conservatives at least, it seems that being better informed and better at reasoning predicts that you'll be a more committed climate denialist than your peers. And I'll come back to that curious phenomenon later. Those are the references to that research on the bottom of the slide if you're interested in it. Okay, so this is unusual. This is perhaps counterintuitive. And so let's build up a picture of what's happening here in these sorts of cases. So the first thing we need to think about, it seems to me here, is the role that social networks play in our lives as knowers and as reasoners. Our capacity to acquire knowledge as solitary inquirers, in fact, is quite limited. When we reflect on it, we quickly recognize that the vast bulk of what we know because we've been told it by other people. Where were you born? How do you know? Which planet is closest to our sun? How do you know? Do you have a spleen? How do you know? Whenever we accept what we're told by someone else without testing it for ourselves or being independently sure of its truth, we're taking what we're told as true on trust. We're taking somebody's word for it. We're trusting that the speaker or the source that we're reading in a book, for instance, has good grounds for saying what she has said to us, and that on this basis we can take what they say to be true. So let's say I walk into the room and I say to you, wow, it's raining cats and dogs outside. You take my word for it, and now, if what I'm saying is true, that you have a true belief that you've acquired from me, from my telling you something that's the case. Now, trusting one another in this way is a ubiquitous feature of everyday life. It would be practically impossible, not to mention pathological, to test everything that we're told and to seek out independent confirmation of it. And from a philosophical point of view, gaining knowledge through being told something by someone else is a perfectly respectable way of acquiring knowledge. What's more, it allows us to acquire true beliefs very cheaply. That is, without having to expend the effort associated with assessing the evidence or evaluating arguments for ourselves. But, obviously, acquiring information from others is only a reliable and efficient procedure if the sources we are trusting are trustworthy. Believing on the basis of trust is a highly risky strategy. It relies upon the ability to effectively guard against being duped by liars or accidentally misled by well-intentioned misinformation shared by others. And we need to exercise epistemic vigilance to experience the benefits and avoid the dangers of acquiring knowledge from social sources. And there's some evidence that actually we're pretty good at this on the whole. Individually and collectively, we do exercise epistemic vigilance fairly well, and we screen out unreliable sources of information most of the time. But what happens when our collective efforts at epistemic vigilance go astray, and we're led to distrust those who are trustworthy and trust those who are untrustworthy? And this, I suggest, is part of the story of what's happening in social networks of climate skepticism. So in these networks, an unfavourable social context is created by the coexistence of three factors. Firstly, there's misinformation. Mistaken views with some plausibility and attractiveness are present in the pool of opinions. Sometimes when you find unfavourable social context like this, the beliefs are simply persistent historical beliefs. Creationism might be an example here. Sometimes these beliefs are intentionally propagated, and this is well documented in the case of doubts, for instance, about the carcinogenic properties of tobacco, or doubts about that human activity is the cause of climate change. So misinformation in the pool is the first factor that needs to be present. The second is uptake. So a false view sitting on a table somewhere is not going to do any harm, but when it's taken up within a community by at least some trusted members of that epistemic community, then those beliefs start to take a life of their own within that social network. And they can be seen as legitimate and accepted as true on that basis. So uptake is the second factor. The third really crucial factor is discrediting. This is crucial. So this third factor in these unfavourable contexts, as I'm calling them, is the fact that there is distrust or dismissal of those who espouse alternative views, so that the views of opponents are effectively taken out of the conversation as legitimate options. Now, discrediting of this kind can be the result of implicit biases and prejudices, or in the case of political polarisation, it can be justified by beliefs about the malevolence or even the stupidity of those who espouse alternative views. Whatever the case, the result of discrediting is to filter discourse, so that communications from distrusted groups are not taken seriously in the way that other communications are. And here the attempts at epistemic vigilance, as it were, backfire and tragically screen out the very sources of information or argument that need to be considered. Now, with these conditions in place, we're prone to an effect called group polarisation. A well-attested body of evidence shows that if deliberation occurs among like-minded individuals, the very process of seeking to reason about one's views with others, in conversation with others, leads people to hold their views even more strongly than when they began. Why does this occur? Well, it's a feature of human psychology that we readily accept arguments in favour of views that we already hold, but we're willing to devote considerable cognitive effort to discredit arguments against views we hold. In essence, we're good at applying reason to identify problems with views we oppose, but we're quite poor at critically assessing arguments that support views that we hold. And this has been described as a my-side bias in human reasoning. We tend to mobilise our rational faculties to defend my side of a debate. And this is a bias that we all share. And in fact, it's been argued by Hugo Mercier and Daniel Sperber in a recent fascinating book called The Enigma of Reason, that the my-side bias is actually an evolutionary adaptation. Specifically, that it's adapted for reasoning in groups. When we reason with others, it's advantageous and efficient if we each focus on finding the flaws in the views we disagree with, and we don't bother too much about critically reflecting on our own views. What this creates, they argue, is a cognitive division of labour, which, on average, leads the group to arrive at rationally defensible views, with the least cognitive effort on the part of the individuals. However, if groups engaged in reasoning together happen to be a group of like-minded people, then the group tends to pool the reasons to believe the things they already believe without subjecting those views to any really deep scrutiny. And at the same time, the group of like-minded people mobilize their critical faculties to identify reasons not to accept the views of others with whom they disagree. So the result is that when like-minded people deliberate with one another about what to believe, even when they're trying to engage their critical faculties, they tend to come to believe the thing that there are more and better reasons for the things that they already believe than they previously thought, and that those who think otherwise are not only mistaken, but in fact unreasonable. So in the unfavourable conditions that I've described, where opponents are discredited and debate occurs only within a social network of like-minded people, this is precisely what happens. And a self-confirming feedback loop results. Group deliberations among, in this case, climate skeptics strengthens the justification for not taking proponents of the alternative view seriously, since they come to be seen as proponents of views that are manifestly at odds with what is reasonable. Hence, the proponents of such counterviews must be stupid, foolish, or deceitful. So much so that even ordinary cues of reliability, such as somebody's being a professional scientist or representing a body of scientists, can be discounted. So polarization breeds further polarization, and the defences against alternative points of view become very powerful. And this is why the politicisation of climate science in particular has been such a successful strategy for those wanting to keep scepticism alive. Now, if the analysis that I've given is right, then climate skeptics and climate deniers are in fact no less intelligent or well-informed than others. But they found themselves, lamentably, in an unfavourable social context where their usually reliable practices of deference to credible sources and their practices of screening out non-credible sources have mistakenly led them into what we might call an epistemic backwater. And feedback loops have led them to hold mistaken views with unwarranted confidence. But if we take a step back, it's important that we recognise that all of us, to some extent, exist within epistemic tribes. And these epistemic tribes do have a tendency to discredit and dismiss alternative points of view, sometimes with good justification, sometimes without good justification. And none of us is immune to this. I think this result, actually, once we look at the data, is quite democratizing in some ways. The point of this, though, is not that that there is necessarily some truth in every point of view, and that we need to include every point of view in order to have a view of the whole truth. The point is rather that a well-functioning community of inquiry requires a healthy dose of diversity. Critical inquiry, scientific inquiry, is a team sport, and the quality of one's opponents is just as important to the play as the quality of one's own team. In an environment that is increasingly siloed in terms of our news sources, and in an environment that is in many cases intentionally seeded with misinformation, these are important factors to bear in mind. And it seems to me here that in this political landscape, universities have a particularly important role to play in our epistemic life as a society. In general, academic inquiry does have some important features that can enable it to avoid traps of group polarization and to harness the cognitive gains that can be made by collective inquiry and mutual criticism. Scientific communities, for the most part, include a diverse pool of contributors. They expose contributions to critical scrutiny from all comers through publication, and they do actually encourage dissent and reward overturning of accepted views. So these are structural features of scientific inquiry that I think are positives. Although we know, of course, that universities are not immune from groupthink. Deliberative bubbles and epistemic tribalism can and does occur in the academy as well. And for those of us who are in the academy, it's not always as easy to identify cases of this as it is in the case of climate skepticism, for instance. And of course, we academics are strongly disinclined to believe that we're easily duped or led astray. We also tend to overvalue our individual cognitive capacities over the cognitive capacities that come from an organized, collective kind of inquiry, mode of inquiry. So, but these things, these failures occur within the university too. And of course, academic inquiry will always be fallible and open to revision, but it will be stronger when a healthy diversity of participants and critical points of view are present. In addition, it's really imperative that universities are consciously, publicly and tenaciously oriented by universal and intrinsic values. Values such as justice, peace, environmental protection, health and well-being. The university must be and be perceived to be serving the public good. The flip side of this, of course, is a warning about conflicts of interest. In the skeptical literature, you often find accusations that scientists are in it for the money, they're in bed with corporate interests, or in some other way their work is tainted by self-interest. In most cases, of course, this is simply false. But there is a lesson to be learned here nonetheless. The academic community must do its best to meet the highest standards of integrity, independence, and academic rigor. And with external funding and industry partnerships the new norm in the modern academy, many academics face real temptations and dilemmas in this area, and they're forced compromises do provide an opening for attacks by those who would seek to undermine trust in scientific inquiry. Finally, I'd also suggest that research and critical inquiry must be for everyone and include everyone. A longer-term strategy to build robust and warranted trust in institutions of learning and research is the democratization of education and of the academic community itself. And there are not only epistemic benefits to this, which I've talked about. The more interaction there is with science and scholarship, the less people are likely to see scientists and scholars as a breed of elite others who hand down knowledge like priests. And the more diverse and representative the scientific community is, the more direct personal connections members of the broader public will have with scientists and scholars. When the scientific community is intertwined with other social networks, it's less plausible to see it as a hostile group of others. Now, I'm not wanting to suggest that universities alone will reverse the trend towards political polarization, but public good universities that welcome diverse viewpoints and engage in robust collective inquiry can provide a fallible but credible anchor point for public discourse through the rocky times that are no doubt ahead. Thank you.
Now, in the spirit of robust public discourse, we have some time for questions. Any questions?
Yeah, I've got two questions to both presenters. As for bias a function of mind and thinking, that is the brain, or feeling and desire, that is the heart, especially when the latter has been neglected in science as if it's an obstacle rather than a problem for further critical investigation. The other question is to the second presenter. Is truth diversity-based or is it reality-based? If you want to deal with climate change in this issue, don't we go straight to climate change and not the views held by people about climate change, because they will always be conflicting. The issue here is for all of us, as a diverse group of scientists, address climate change as a single issue that is presented to us as part of reality rather than part of this diversity. To focus it on diversity, I think it won't solve the problems. We may not resolve it because we will deal with variations as we do now. You outlined these variations as problems. How do we have to go back to diversity-based kind of framework in order to address climate change as a single issue? It's just a single issue presented to us.
Okay. Do you want to talk about the
Yes,
bias
please.
and emotion question?
Yeah, so to answer the first question about whether or not this bias is something that's cognitively motivated or if it's more of an affective process that occurs through more feeling components. I think most of the literature to date has primarily focused on the cognitive basis of this. So lots of studies have looked at people's like response times to automatically associated words and shown that there's a bias towards the status quo, which tends to point more towards a cognitive explanation. That said, as you mentioned, affect is very instrumental to motivating behavior. So you need to have this sort of affective response in order to put thought into action. So while there hasn't been much work on the affective components of this bias, I do agree with you and think that there is an affective component that puts this cognition into action.
And more so hinders the cognitive tendency. Does feeling have eyes to see like mine? I'm not sure. You seem to be setting aside the affective as if it's not important. You seem to be pushing the cognitive. I think we need to address both.
Yeah. I agree with you completely. I think the cognition potentially is where the eyes come into play. So the affect is the general sort of impulse, pushing or pulling people to or from a different goal. And then the cognition is sort of the eyes directing when in one direction or the other. So affect on its own is neither positive nor negative. I think it's really about the cognition that's putting that affect into one direction versus the other that could potentially be the problem with people's tendency to justify the status quo. So it's directing people's focus away from social change and orienting it towards system stability. But affect itself is neither good nor bad.
Just quickly on the question of climate change, I think that fundamentally we need to be having a public conversation about climate change based on the best scientific understanding of the facts of the matter. The facts of the matter never completely resolve any policy questions, but having the facts on hand is crucial. So there is, I take it, a truth of the matter here. And when I talk about diversity, I'm not talking about a kind of mushy diversity of different perspectives on what's happening in the world. I'm talking about a model of scientific inquiry that inquires about the true state of affairs in the world, but which is a social activity in which many contributors bring evidence, argumentation to the table, and collectively there's a sorting and weighing of that evidence, and some sort of consensus can emerge, which is exactly what's happened on the question of climate change. And that's the reason why I take it as a premise of my talk that we should accept the truth that humans are causing climate change and so forth, precisely because I defer not to an individual scientist, but to the collective judgment that's accrued within the scientific community that's studied these things over a period of decades.
Yeah, but from a philosophical point of view, it is not so much what science says about climate change, no philosophy, but what climate change really is. That's the issue.
There's absolutely bigger philosophical and social issues at stake here. I'm not sure if this is what you're alluding to, but there's a question about humanity, who we are, what we want to be, where we've come from, how we've arrived at this time. There are economic, cultural, religious dimensions to this. So there's a rich tapestry of different issues that come into play when we're thinking about this present moment. So if that's the point you're making, then I completely agree with you. And I didn't mean to downplay that at all here. Mm.
Thank you.
Questions?
Do you split I liked your examples about how do we know we were spleen and where we're born, but in all those cases you can find evidence for it.
Sorry, you can.
In those instances, there's evidence for these things, as
Yes.
well as being told them. So,
Yeah.
but there's other things we're told that are just based without evidence. Is there kind of a division in that sort of kind of reason-based belief in what somebody says versus things that are not?
Yeah, so most of the things that we learn by the testimony of others, there are evidence for, and there's not too many steps you need to go through if you want to actually go and sort of check out the evidence for yourself. And so if I came in here and said, oh, it's raining cats and dogs outside, actually you could peer through the window and have a look for yourself. Or even if the window was closed, it wouldn't take too much to check, right? So there's a check on my own integrity as a communicator at that point, and there's evidence that you can easily access for yourself. In some cases, we rely upon expert testimony in a more intrinsic kind of way. So climate change might be an example where actually to acquire the competence in the relevant disciplines to assess the evidence for myself would require quite a big investment of time and energy. And in those cases, it's still possible, but because of the cognitive division of labour within our society, it's more effective and efficient if we can rely upon the work of others, and we do that all the time. There might be some other cases where there is no straightforward path to assessing evidence on a question. There are some things that philosophers call social facts, for instance. So Wellington is the capital of New Zealand. How do we know that? Well, you can't go to Wellington and see that it's the capital, right? There's nothing that you could look at. And in some ways, the status of being the capital of New Zealand is something that is true because it's socially recognised. And so in that case, the sorts of procedures that you go through to test whether something is true or false would be different. So there are different kinds of cases, but I think in most of the cases, if we're accepting what somebody says as true, we're implicitly assuming that there's some way of verifying that or justifying it, which we could also engage in.
So my follow-up question then is, where does this get us by 2030? Is, because you mentioned the role of universities in debating things, but do they also have a role in collecting evidence?
In collecting,
Evidence.
do universities have a role in collecting evidence?
Basically collecting facts and
Yeah.
presenting this to society.
Yes, I think they do. Universities have a role in collecting evidence and data for society. It's possible that we might see universities called on more and more to do fact-checking as well, because of the controversies about sources of information in the media. I guess what I've been arguing in this presentation is that the core work of the university needs to continue and be strengthened, particularly at a time when it's potentially at risk from corrupting factors, which would undermine the credibility and the actual practice of research within the university.
I just got a question for the first speaker. It was recently published a thing that said something like they expect women's wages to be equal to men's in 197 years or 205 or something around 200 years. Do you think this can be changed? Because it sounds like, no, we can't
to speed things up, to speed social change. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it kind of also begs the question, like, how does social change occur if there is this basic tendency towards supporting the status quo? I think it really requires these flashpoint moments in history. So something like same-sex marriage. You know, if you had said 10 years ago that we were going to have same-sex marriage in most Western countries, a lot of people would not believe that that would happen. So it takes a certain spark to initiate rapid social change. But once that rapid social change is initiated, it then kind of becomes incorporated into the status quo, and people wind up supporting it. So if there's a way to kind of make that flashpoint happen for women's rights, and in particular wage equality, once that initial flame is kind of lit, that's when social change occurs. But predicting when that flashpoint's going to happen is really kind of the $64,000 question.
Okay, we might have to leave it there. When we planned the lectures, we were hoping to have drinks and nibbles outside and further opportunities for discussions, but the accountants put a big kibosh on that over here. So we don't have drinks and nibbles outside, but I'm sure Danny and Mathison would be happy to answer any other questions you have. So thank you very much for coming, and let's just thank the speakers once more.